Hey there, sleepless rabble. Tonight we're unraveling one of the strangest true crime cases you'll ever hear. A quiet Russian historian who spent his days wandering graveyards, and his nights turning that obsession into something far darker. For years, he lived in an apartment filled with what looked like oversized dolls. Except they weren't dolls at all. This is a 360-degree dive into the life of Anatoly Moskvin, his childhood, the obsessions that shaped him, the secret world he built in his flat, and what happened when the truth finally came crashing into daylight. It sounds like a gothic legend, but it isn't. It's real. So settle in, close your eyes, and let me take you through the eerie tale of the so-called puppet maker of Nizhny Novgorod. And if you enjoy drifting off to the darker corners of history, you know the deal. Like, subscribe, or even support the project at ko-fi.com/napmax. And tonight's question for you: what's the creepiest toy or object you ever had in your room as a kid? The one that stared a little too long or felt a little too alive. This is Napmax Sleep Stories, and you're listening to the tale of Anatoly Moskvin. Now, let's begin. It was November 2011 in Nizhny Novgorod, an old Russian city where life usually moved in a grey, predictable rhythm. The police who climbed the stairs of a drab apartment block that day were not expecting history. They were investigating grave desecrations, a string of cases that had disturbed families and irritated the authorities. On paper, this was routine. Paperwork, interviews, maybe an eccentric suspect who liked cemeteries too much. What they walked into was anything but routine. The door opened onto a flat that seemed cluttered but ordinary at first glance. Books stacked high, newspapers piled on chairs, and scattered objects that gave the impression of a man who lived more with ideas than with people. But then there were the dolls, dozens of them. They were large, far too large, and each one sat propped in a way that suggested the owner wanted them to appear alive. Some wore bright dresses, others shawls or ribbons. Their faces were stiff, pale, oddly lifeless. At first, the officers did what anyone might do in that split second of confusion. They told themselves they were just dolls. Strange, yes. Oversized and uncanny, but still just fabric and plastic. But something about the room was wrong. The air was heavy, carrying a sweetness that didn't belong, a smell they would later struggle to describe without wrinkling their noses. One officer leaned closer to a figure in a child's dress and noticed that the face wasn't really a face at all. It was a mask, crudely painted and stretched. Beneath the wax and fabric was not plastic. It was something human. The realization did not come as a scream or a dramatic shout, but as a quiet, horrified recognition. The dolls weren't dolls. They were children, or what remained of them. Bodies, dried and preserved, dressed and arranged as if they had never died. Everywhere they looked, another figure stared back, in corners, on sofas, against the wall. 26 of them in total, though in the chaos of that first hour it felt like far more. Each one different, yet united by the same grotesque attempt at animation. A living room transformed into a crypt. The officers tried to remain professional, but years later some admitted the scene was unlike anything they had faced. They were not hardened by this kind of crime, because this was not a crime they had ever been trained to imagine. Burglary, assault, murder, these they knew. But dolls that were not dolls, a home that was also a graveyard, and a suspect who sat quietly among them. This was something else entirely. And at the center of it all was Anatoly Moskvin, a middle-aged historian with glasses and a calm expression, who watched as police peeled back the fabric of his private world. He did not resist. He did not deny. He simply observed, as if the only surprise was that it had taken so long for anyone to notice. This was the moment when a quiet Russian city became the backdrop to one of the strangest and most unsettling discoveries of modern crime. And yet, as shocking as the scene was, it was only the beginning. The full weight of horror would only become clear when those closest to him, his mother, his neighbors, and eventually the entire city, tried to understand what had been living in that apartment all along. Shock is rarely cinematic in real life. There were no dramatic shouts or weapons drawn when the truth sank in. Instead, there was silence, broken only by the sound of officers shifting uneasily on their feet. They were trained men, accustomed to crime scenes, but nothing in their manuals had prepared them for this. 26 children's bodies dressed as dolls, staring back from every corner of a modest Soviet-era apartment. One officer later admitted he froze. Another described feeling the urge to leave the room immediately, to step back into the cold stairwell and pretend the sight had been a hallucination. But there was no escape. The smell alone anchored them in reality, not the sharp stench of rot, but the cloying, sickly air of bodies preserved and disguised. A perfume of chemicals, dust, and something older. In the kitchen, his mother stood bewildered. She had lived in that flat the entire time, surrounded by what she truly believed were dolls. Large, unusual dolls, yes, but her son had always been eccentric. She cooked meals while they sat in the living room. She cleaned around them. She never once imagined that her home had been turned into a mausoleum. Reporters later pressed her with the obvious question, how could she not know? Her answer was always the same. She thought they were just strange toys, the product of Anatoly's endless odd projects. She never suspected he had brought children back from their graves. The investigators tried to question Moskvin in those first hours, but what unnerved them most was his calmness. He didn't pace or break down. He explained in measured tones that he had not harmed anyone. He had merely preserved them, saved them from loneliness in the soil. To him, this was not a confession, but a defense. He insisted he had acted with compassion. As forensic teams arrived, the scene became even harder to process. When they moved the bodies, some made faint mechanical sounds. The music boxes Moskvin had hidden inside them rattled into life, playing fractured melodies in the middle of a crime scene. Officers found eyes crudely replaced with buttons or plastic spheres, painted to mimic childhood innocence. Faces stiffened by wax looked almost cartoonish in the harsh light. The grotesque care he had taken in preserving them was more disturbing than neglect would have been. For his mother, it was unbearable. Witnesses recalled her crying, repeating that she had never known, never imagined. Her son, the brilliant historian, the quiet man who still lived at home in middle age, had transformed her apartment into something no parent could fathom. She didn't try to defend him. She simply struggled to understand, like everyone else. The scene that day was not just the discovery of a crime. It was the collapse of normality. An ordinary flat, an ordinary family, revealed to be hiding a secret that belonged more to horror fiction than to the evening news. And outside, in the stairwell and the streets beyond, the story was already beginning to leak. Neighbors, journalists, and soon an entire city would learn that the man they thought they knew was living with the dead. The story slipped out of the apartment before the police had even finished their work. By evening, the stairwell was crowded with neighbors whispering to each other, trading fragments of what they thought they had seen. Some swore the officers had carried out mannequins wrapped in sheets. Others insisted they saw the shape of small bodies, too human to mistake. In a building where gossip usually revolved around leaking pipes and noisy tenants, the rumor now was that one resident had been living with the dead. The local press arrived quickly, tipped off by leaks from inside the investigation. Reporters camped at the entrance, cameras angled toward the shabby grey building as if waiting for something else to be carried out. Interviews with neighbours followed the usual script. He was quiet, eccentric, always reading, sometimes strange but never threatening. One woman said she often smelled something odd in the stairwell, but assumed it came from rubbish bins or damp walls. Another recalled once seeing a large doll through the open door and dismissing it as harmless clutter. Each detail, once ordinary, now sounded like negligence. By the next morning, the headlines had settled on nicknames that would travel far beyond Nizhny Novgorod. The puppet maker, the Russian doll collector, the Lord of the Mummies. Tabloids leaned into horror, printing blurred photographs of officers carrying away bulky figures under sheets. Television anchors spoke solemnly, promising viewers that yes, the rumors were true. A respected historian had been found living with dozens of mummified children disguised as dolls. The city was horrified, but also fascinated. This was not the kind of crime that people were used to reading about. No guns, no mafia links, no blood on the pavement. Instead, a violation of something sacred. Graves, memory, rest. Families began phoning the authorities in panic, demanding to know whether their daughters' remains had been stolen. Some discovered the worst. The graves they had visited for years were empty. Their children had been sitting in a stranger's apartment, dressed and displayed as if still alive. For those parents, grief had reopened like a wound. They had to bury their children twice. Meanwhile, the press dug into Anatoly Moskvin's past. His articles on burial rituals were reprinted with sinister emphasis. The once quirky academic was now painted as a man whose lifelong fascination with cemeteries had turned criminal. Colleagues spoke cautiously. Yes, he was brilliant, fluent in languages, encyclopedic in his knowledge of local history. Yes, he was odd, perhaps too fixated on death, but a grave robber. A man living with corpses. They struggled to reconcile the two versions. On trams and in markets, people lowered their voices, yet could not stop talking about it. The story spread faster than official statements could keep up. Some residents felt shame that their city was now globally associated with such grotesquerie. Others leaned into the macabre celebrity of it all, telling outsiders that they lived near the apartment of the puppet maker, as if proximity to horror lent them a strange status. And through it all, Moskvin himself remained curiously composed. When paraded before cameras, he did not rant or deny. He explained softly, almost patiently, that he had done nothing wrong. He had saved the girls, kept them warm, given them love. In his telling, the crime was not desecration, but compassion. The world simply misunderstood. But the world was not ready to see him as anything other than monstrous. And to understand how a man could arrive at such a conviction, that he was rescuing children by stealing their bodies, one has to look backwards, into the shadowed corridors of his childhood, where the seeds of this obsession first took root. Long before the headlines, before the dolls and the whispered nicknames, there was a boy standing at the edge of a grave. It was the early 1970s, and 12-year-old Anatoly was taken to a funeral in his village. Funerals in the Soviet Union carried their own rituals, somber, efficient, and usually stripped of excess emotion. But this one came with an extra cruelty. The deceased was a young girl, not much older than him, laid out in an open coffin. For the adults around him, this was an ordinary farewell. For Anatoly, it became a memory that would burn itself into the rest of his life. At some point during the ceremony, accounts differ whether it was a relative, a neighbor, or simply a stern adult enforcing tradition, instructed the boy to come forward. He was urged, then pressured, to lean in and kiss the face of the dead girl. It was supposed to be a gesture of respect, of farewell, an old custom meant to show courage. But for a child, it was nothing less than traumatic. He leaned over, pressed his lips to cold skin, and in that instant learned what death felt like up close. Later, when psychiatrists asked about his past, this was the moment he always returned to. The kiss on the dead girl's face was not just an unpleasant childhood memory, it was a wound that never closed. He described it as the day he was bound to death forever. Where other children grew up and left such moments behind, Anatoly carried it with him, polishing it in memory until it became part of his identity. After the funeral, he began spending more and more time in cemeteries. At first, it seemed like morbid curiosity. He walked among gravestones, copying down names and dates, cataloguing epitaphs as if they were clues. Adults thought it was eccentric, but harmless. A boy who preferred silence to games, who found comfort among the dead instead of the living. In Soviet culture, where superstition and tradition often lingered just beneath the surface of ideology, this behavior was strange but not unimaginable. The dead were part of life, after all. For Anatoly, however, the dead became more than part of life. They became companions. He spoke later of sleeping on graves, of feeling the presence of those buried beneath. He claimed he was studying ancient rituals, imitating druids and Siberian shamans who believed that lying on graves allowed communication with spirits. To him, this was research. To outsiders, if they had known, it would have looked like obsession. The kiss at that funeral was supposed to be the end of a story. A farewell to a child taken too soon. Instead, it became the prologue to a life spent chasing the dead. While his classmates played football or dreamed of careers, Anatoly's path bent sharply towards cemeteries, folklore, and a fascination with what lay beneath the soil. And as he grew older, that fascination would not fade. It would shape his studies, his career, and eventually, the private world he built inside his parents' apartment. The boy who once kissed the face of the dead girl would become the man who surrounded himself with them. Long before the headlines, before the dolls and the whispered nicknames, there was a boy standing at the edge of a grave. It was the early 1970s, and 12-year-old Anatoly was taken to a funeral in his village. Funerals in the Soviet Union carried their own rituals, somber, efficient, and usually stripped of excess emotion. But this one came with an extra cruelty. The deceased was a young girl, not much older than him, laid out in an open coffin. For the adults around him, this was an ordinary farewell. For Anatoly, it became a memory that would burn itself into the rest of his life. At some point during the ceremony, accounts differ whether it was a relative, a neighbor, or simply a stern adult enforcing tradition, instructed the boy to come forward. He was urged, then pressured, to lean in and kiss the face of the dead girl. It was supposed to be a gesture of respect, of farewell, an old custom meant to show courage. But for a child, it was nothing less than traumatic. He leaned over, pressed his lips to cold skin, and in that instant learned what death felt like up close. Later, when psychiatrists asked about his past, this was the moment he always returned to. The kiss on the dead girl's face was not just an unpleasant childhood memory. It was a wound that never closed. He described it as the day he was bound to death forever. Where other children grew up and left such moments behind, Anatoly carried it with him, polishing it in memory until it became part of his identity. After the funeral, he began spending more and more time in cemeteries. At first, it seemed like morbid curiosity. He walked among gravestones, copying down names and dates, cataloguing epitaphs as if they were clues. Adults thought it was eccentric but harmless. A boy who preferred silence to games, who found comfort among the dead instead of the living. In Soviet culture, where superstition and tradition often lingered just beneath the surface of ideology, this behavior was strange, but not unimaginable. The dead were part of life, after all. For Anatoly, however, the dead became more than part of life. They became companions. He spoke later of sleeping on graves, of feeling the presence of those buried beneath. He claimed he was studying ancient rituals, imitating druids and Siberian shamans who believed that lying on graves allowed communication with spirits. To him, this was research. To outsiders, if they had known, it would have looked like obsession. The kiss at that funeral was supposed to be the end of a story, a farewell to a child taken too soon. Instead, it became the prologue to a life spent chasing the dead. While his classmates played football or dreamed of careers, Anatoly's path bent sharply towards cemeteries, folklore, and a fascination with what lay beneath the soil. And as he grew older, that fascination would not fade. It would shape his studies, his career, and eventually the private world he built inside his parents' apartment. The boy who once kissed the face of the dead girl would become the man who surrounded himself with them. University did little to pull Anatoly into the world of the living. If anything, it gave him the freedom to sink even deeper into his own strange orbit. While other students crowded cafeterias, whispered in lecture halls about politics or romance, Anatoly spent his free hours wandering cemeteries. He described them as sanctuaries, quieter than libraries, richer than any classroom. Where others saw graves, he saw archives. Each stone was a record, each name a thread in a story only he seemed willing to follow. His professors noticed his brilliance immediately. He could switch between languages without effort, quote obscure text from memory, and trace links between ancient Celtic practices and local Slavic folklore as though he had lived them himself. He was not the kind of student who scraped by. He was the one who left others struggling to keep up. Yet his talent came packaged with strangeness. He rarely socialized, never attended student parties, and seemed oblivious to the rituals of youth. He lived at home with his parents, studied late into the night, and treated his peers with a kind of distant politeness that discouraged closeness. Colleagues later said he seemed almost untouched by adult life. He never dated, never sought friendships outside academic discussions, never gave the impression of wanting to join the crowd. To him, companionship was found in books and in the company of the dead. More than once he admitted to sleeping on graves, explaining it as research, a way of connecting with ancient traditions. He cited druids, shamans, mystics, presenting his behavior not as morbid curiosity, but as anthropology. Few challenged him. After all, he was brilliant, and brilliance often excuses eccentricity. Over time, he developed a reputation as a local expert on burial grounds. He knew the geography of cemeteries better than most caretakers. He mapped them, catalogued them, traced their histories. Journalists writing about forgotten graveyards turned to him for commentary. He seemed to belong more to those places than to the streets of the living city. What unsettled some classmates was his casualness with the subject of death. Where others stumbled, he spoke fluently. Where others avoided the subject, he leaned in. He described rituals of burial and mummification with the same tone one might use to describe farming techniques or weather patterns. Death was not taboo for him. It was a profession, an interest, even a comfort. This detachment from the living world deepened with age. By his 30s, Anatoly was still living at home, unmarried, without children, without the milestones his peers had reached. His life revolved around cemeteries, languages, and the endless pursuit of historical trivia. Neighbors saw him as polite but odd. Students respected his intellect but avoided personal interaction. Professors praised his research but worried quietly about his isolation. In hindsight, it seems obvious. A man who spent so much time among the dead, who treated graveyards as playgrounds, who blurred the line between research and obsession, was drifting steadily away from the normal rhythm of human life. But at the time, few recognized it as dangerous. He was eccentric, yes, but eccentricity was tolerated, even admired in academics. And so, Anatoly Moskvin carried on, brilliant, isolated, and increasingly bound to the dead. Each year the line between scholar and grave dweller blurred further. Soon, it would no longer be enough to study graves. Soon, he would begin to cross them. Night in a Russian cemetery is not a place most people would choose to spend their time. For Anatoly Moskvin, it was where he felt most at home. By the late 1990s, his days were filled with writing articles, translating obscure texts, and contributing to the quiet world of historical journals. His nights, however, were something else entirely. When the city slept, Anatoly walked to the graveyards. He knew the caretakers' routines, the gaps in the fencing, the parts of the grounds that fell into complete shadow after dusk. What he was doing there was never casual. These were not strolls. They were pilgrimages. He later claimed these nocturnal visits were still research. He was studying local rituals, recording headstones, documenting how families honored their dead. He even wrote extensively for newspapers about forgotten cemeteries, producing thousands of articles. To an outsider, that sounded like dedication to scholarship. But the truth is that his presence in those graveyards had less to do with history and more to do with obsession. He began carrying blankets, sometimes even sleeping directly on the graves. In interviews, he explained this as imitation of ancient druids and Siberian shamans who sought communion with spirits by lying on the earth above them. He described the experience as comforting, as if the ground itself whispered back. His language was that of an anthropologist, but his behavior was that of a man slowly stepping out of the world of the living. Neighbors sometimes saw him leaving at dusk with a bag and returning in the early morning. They assumed he was working late at libraries, or simply indulging in his eccentric hobbies. Nobody suspected he was bedding down among the tombstones, keeping a vigil with the dead. Over time, his routines grew bolder. He started seeking out fresh graves, the ones still marked by flowers, the soil not yet settled. He claimed he could feel the presence of the newly departed more strongly, that the connection between this world and the next was thinnest in those first days. He watched funerals, sometimes even attended them as a bystander, quietly observing, taking notes. It was in these moments that his fascination began to tip towards something darker. The rituals he cited in his defense, the druids, the shamans, the folkloric traditions, were his shield. They provided an academic excuse, a scholarly gloss over nights spent in places most people avoided. But even he must have sensed he was drifting further than research allowed. He wasn't just documenting graves anymore. He was listening, waiting, and in his own words, beginning to think of himself as a protector of the dead. It was a small step, but a decisive one. In Anatoly's mind, lying on graves was not enough. Taking notes was not enough. If the dead were to be protected, if they were to be rescued from the loneliness he imagined for them, then eventually he would have to act. And that is how, after years of wandering cemeteries under cover of darkness, Anatoly Moskvin moved toward the act that would define him forever, opening a grave and bringing what lay beneath it home. There comes a point when obsession demands escalation. For Anatoly, years of lying on graves, years of listening to silence, were no longer enough. By the early 2000s, he began to act on the thought that had been circling him since childhood. The dead did not belong in the cold ground. They deserved company, warmth, a home. And so, one night, he chose a grave. He knew exactly where to go. His notebooks were full of names and dates, copied from headstones, obituaries, and local cemetery records. He had already been mapping the city's dead for years, compiling what police would later call a private catalogue of potential companions. On this night, he chose the grave of a young girl, recently buried, the soil still soft. Armed with tools, he moved with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed this in his head countless times. The act itself was brutally simple: dig, open, lift. But in his telling, it was not theft. It was rescue. He said later that he couldn't stand the thought of a child locked alone in the dark, abandoned by everyone except the worms. He framed himself as the hero of a narrative no one else believed. Carrying her home, he must have known he had crossed an irreversible line. There was no academic justification now. No folkloric excuse that could hide what he had done. But in his mind, it was the fulfillment of his role. He was not desecrating her. He was giving her another life. Back in the apartment, he began to experiment. He tried to preserve the body, drying it out with baking soda and chemicals. He stuffed it with rags to give it shape, wrapped the skin in layers of cloth, covered the face with wax and fabric, until it resembled a crude mask. What emerged from his hands was not a girl, not really, but not a corpse either. It was something in between. A doll, grotesque and fragile, with the ghost of humanity still clinging to it. When investigators later uncovered this first attempt, they described it as amateur, almost clumsy. The mask was rough, the body stiff, but for Moskvin, it was proof of concept. He had taken death and turned it into something he could live with, literally. And once he had done it once, there was no going back. That first child became the beginning of his secret household. She sat propped up in the corner, silent, waiting, while Anatoly convinced himself he had saved her from eternal loneliness. In his mind, she was not a body anymore. She was a companion. From there, the pattern repeated. Another grave, another child. Each time he refined his method, making the dolls sturdier, more lifelike in their strange way. He learned to pad the bodies better, to paint the faces more carefully, to disguise the reality beneath. His apartment slowly filled with them, until every room seemed to hold a figure, watching, waiting. For the families who buried their children, the graves became empty spaces, robbed of the one thing they were meant to protect. But for Anatoly, each grave he opened, each child he carried away, was a victory. He was convinced he was rescuing them, convinced that he was the only one willing to hear their silence. The first exhumation was not the climax of his story. It was only the beginning. Soon, his apartment would become a workshop, a laboratory of the macabre, where dolls that were not dolls multiplied around him. And in his mind, they were no longer strangers. They were daughters. The apartment that Anatoly shared with his parents was never large, but over the years it became something closer to a workshop of the grotesque. He had no laboratory equipment, no official training in preservation, only his resourcefulness and an obsession that left no room for failure. What began with clumsy padding and crude masks soon developed into a strange and unsettling craft. He learned to dry out the bodies with salt and baking soda, layering chemicals he could purchase without attracting suspicion. He stuffed their limbs with rags or cloth to give them shape, turning fragile remains into sturdier figures that could sit or stand without collapsing. Their faces were the hardest part. He experimented with wax, fabric, papier-mâché, anything that could smooth over what lay beneath. The result was masks that looked childish and cartoon-like, frozen in expressions that mocked life without imitating it. Over time, his apartment filled with tools that looked banal to outsiders, but were part of his strange practice. Paints, brushes, cloth, dolls' clothing, wigs. To anyone else, it might have looked like a cluttered hobby room. To Anatoly, it was a sanctuary where his companions were remade. He sewed dresses, adjusted ribbons, painted tiny features. Every detail was a step away from death, a step toward the illusion of life. Some of his choices bordered on the surreal. He placed music boxes inside the bodies so that a tune would play when he moved them. He fitted plastic eyes into empty sockets, or buttons when nothing else was available, insisting that they needed to be able to see cartoons with him. He added little trinkets, toys, jewelry, scraps of fabric to make them more childlike, more his. The dolls were not convincing as real children, but they were convincing enough for him. His parents astonishingly accepted the presence of these life-size figures without pressing too hard for explanations. They thought their son had made dolls, eccentric but harmless. A hobby that cluttered the flat but did not alarm them. They lived among them, ate meals in the same rooms, dusted around them. The truth either eluded them entirely or was too disturbing to confront. By the mid-2000s, the apartment resembled a place out of a nightmare. A cramped Soviet flat transformed into a mausoleum dressed as a nursery. Figures sat propped on chairs, others reclined on sofas, some tucked into beds as though waiting for a story. In photographs leaked years later, the effect was not lifelike but uncanny. Too stiff, too crude, and yet undeniably human. And for Anatoly, this was normal. He moved among them daily, adjusting their clothing, whispering to them, convinced they were safer here than in the ground. Each body became part of his household, another daughter rescued from the indignity of the grave. The apartment ceased to be a home in any conventional sense. It was his workshop, his sanctuary, and his stage. The grotesque transformation of his flat was not a single act, but a process. Repeated and refined until the extraordinary became ordinary. For him, each new doll confirmed that he was right, that he was performing a necessary duty. What others would call desecration, he called salvation. And as his collection grew, so too did his delusion. But the dolls were never simply objects in his workshop. They became, in his mind, members of his family. And that was the next step. To live with them as if they were alive, to treat them not as relics of the dead, but as daughters he had brought home. The dolls were grotesque not because they looked real, but because they didn't. That was the horror. They existed in that uncomfortable middle ground where the mind knows it is staring at death. But the disguise is so crude, so childlike, that it becomes even more disturbing. In photographs later leaked from the investigation, the figures look almost like characters from a dark fairy tale. Stiff masks painted with rosy cheeks, dresses tied with ribbons, wigs sitting awkwardly on heads that were never designed to wear them. Anatoly paid obsessive attention to their faces. He hated the sight of decay, so he worked to cover it up. Layers of wax and cloth became masks that he painted by hand. Sometimes he stitched features onto fabric, sewing mouths that would never open, shaping eyes that could never see. To complete the illusion, he bought children's clothes from markets, picking bright, playful outfits. He wanted them to look like daughters, not corpses. And so they sat in dresses, sweaters, even little shoes, a parody of childhood, trapped in silence. But he did not stop at appearances. He wanted them to feel alive in ways only he could appreciate. Some contain music boxes hidden inside their torsos. Move them, and a tinny melody would play, echoing through the cluttered apartment like a lullaby warped by death. He fitted others with eyes. Plastic spheres, buttons, or doll parts, so that, as he put it, they could watch television with him. He placed stuffed toys in their arms, propped books in their laps, set them at tables as if mid-conversation. Each detail was his attempt to erase the line between a grave and a home. The absurdity of it all might have been laughable if it weren't so deeply tragic. Investigators later described the figures as fragile, almost hollow, yet arranged with the care of someone who believed they were precious. One doll had a face drawn in marker beneath its mask, as though he had tried to give her a personality. Another wore jewelry he had salvaged from the grave. Several had fragments of gravestones sewn into their padding, as if carrying a piece of their past life within them. For Anatoly, this was not madness, but responsibility. He insisted that he was giving them what their families could not. A continuation, a chance to exist in his world rather than vanish underground. He believed the dolls were safer in his flat than in the soil. He spoke of them not as objects but as children who had been abandoned by everyone except him. And his parents? They lived among them, apparently never questioning too much. His mother once told investigators she thought they were just large, homemade toys. Perhaps denial is easier than admitting what stares you in the face. They ate meals with the dolls nearby, cleaned the rooms where they sat, celebrated holidays in a flat already full of silent guests. For the outside world, the idea of living among 26 mummified children dressed as dolls was unbearable. For Anatoly, it was routine. He tidied their clothes, dusted their faces, adjusted their wigs, spoke to them daily. They were part of the furniture, part of the household, part of him. The grotesque details were what shocked the world when the story broke. But inside that apartment for years, they were simply normal. And when normality is twisted that far, the next step feels inevitable. The dolls were not just creations in his workshop, they were his family. For Anatoly Moskvin, the dolls were never just objects that sat silently in corners. They were the children he never had, the daughters he believed he had saved from abandonment. He gave them names, spoke to them as if they could answer, and folded them into the rhythms of his daily life. His apartment, cluttered and dim, became something like a household, though one only he could recognize as such. He marked birthdays for them. Neighbors would later recall faint sounds of music drifting from the flat, and though they assumed it was from a television or radio, investigators learned it was often Anatoly himself, quietly singing. He would set out cakes or sweets, small offerings placed near the dolls, as though they could join him in celebration. He decorated them with ribbons, adjusted their clothes, and talked to them about the world outside. Holidays were no different. At New Year, when Russia erupts in fireworks and families gather around tables laden with food, Anatoly arranged his dolls around his own table, dressing them in festive clothes. He poured drinks, lit candles, and created the illusion of a family gathering. It was eerie in its commitment, a theatre of the absurd played out year after year behind closed doors. He read to them too, fairy tales and children's stories. He said later that he wanted them to learn, to be entertained, to feel alive again. He scolded them if they misbehaved, adjusting their posture or speaking sternly into the silence. To him, they were not inert. They were children with personalities, children who deserved structure and care. In this strange domestic life, he saw himself not as a criminal, but as a father. The dolls filled every room. Some were seated at desks as though doing homework. Others lay tucked into beds, carefully arranged beneath blankets. A few were set in playful poses, holding toys or positioned as though mid-conversation. To anyone else, the effect would have been terrifying. To Anatoly, it was comfort. The silence of the apartment was broken only by his voice, and the occasional mechanical jingle of a music box hidden inside one of the dolls, chiming unexpectedly when it was moved. What unsettled investigators most when they pieced this together was not just the physical desecration, but the psychological theatre he built around it. He did not merely steal bodies and disguise them. He lived with them as though they were alive. He created routines, rituals, even rules. He wove them into his reality until the line between fantasy and crime disappeared entirely. For years, no one outside those walls knew. His parents accepted the presence of the dolls, chalking it up to eccentricity. Neighbors dismissed the odd smells, the occasional sounds of singing, as quirks of the man upstairs. And so his secret life continued unchallenged. It is one thing to rob a grave in a single night of madness. It is another to live for nearly a decade in a house full of the dead, treating them as family. That was Moskvin's reality. A parallel domestic life where birthdays were celebrated, stories were read, and silence was filled with imagined voices. But while he played the role of father inside the apartment, outside, he maintained another identity: respected linguist, historian, colleague. The double life was perhaps the strangest part of all. By day, he belonged to the world of academics. By night, he returned home to his daughters of cloth and wax. If anyone had asked his colleagues, they would have described Anatoly Moskvin as brilliant, eccentric, and perhaps a little too intense about his niche interests. He was, after all, a linguist, fluent in more than a dozen languages, a historian who could recall centuries of folklore without a pause, a man whose articles filled local newspapers with dense explorations of burial customs and forgotten cemeteries. He was invited to lecture, to contribute to scholarly journals, to share his expertise on radio programs. In the world of academia, he was tolerated as a harmless oddball, the kind of scholar who lived entirely for his subject. What no one knew was that after those lectures, after those newspaper deadlines, he returned each night to a home full of mummified children, disguised as dolls. The man who impressed professors with his encyclopedic knowledge of Celtic rituals was the same man who tucked his daughters into bed before switching off the lights. The double life was seamless because he had built it that way. To the outside world, he was simply unmarried, middle-aged, still living with his parents. In Russia, that was not unheard of. People shrugged at his lack of a family, his lack of social ties. He was a scholar after all. Who had time for romance when languages and folklore filled every waking hour? If anything, his solitary life seemed to confirm his seriousness. Neighbors noticed him only in fragments. He carried books under his arm, walked quickly, avoided small talk. He was polite, even gentle, but distant. Some thought him shy, others thought him odd. Few thought him dangerous. His oddest habit, the smell that occasionally leaked into the stairwell, was dismissed as damp, old food, or chemicals from whatever project he was working on. They never suspected the source was 26 bodies preserved in the rooms next door. His parents, too, seemed blind to the reality. Perhaps they truly believed the dolls were elaborate creations, toys stitched together by their son in one of his eccentric hobbies. Or perhaps denial was easier than the alternative. They ate dinners while the dolls sat silently nearby. They went about their lives surrounded by what they thought were curiosities. They never once pressed too hard for answers. What astonishes in hindsight is how convincingly ordinary he remained in public. He was not a recluse scribbling in darkness, but a man with an academic footprint, a known figure in local intellectual circles. He wrote thousands of articles, gave interviews, corresponded with other historians. All the while, the secret life continued behind his apartment door, undisturbed, uninterrupted. This contrast, respected historian outside, puppet father inside, is what still unsettles people most. There was no fracture visible to the casual observer. He carried his books, he gave his lectures, he nodded politely in the stairwell, and then he returned home to read bedtime stories to the dead. It raises the question that haunted Russia after his arrest. How many people crossed his path, exchanged words, even praised his intellect, while having no idea that his true life was unfolding in silence among the dolls. And yet, to understand why Moskvin never saw himself as criminal, why he sat calmly explaining to police that he had done nothing wrong, we have to step inside his mind. A mind that had rationalized decades of obsession into a philosophy of care. When Anatoly Moskvin sat across from the psychiatrist assigned to evaluate him, he didn't look like a monster. He looked like a tired academic, glasses perched on his nose, hair thinning, clothes unremarkable. He spoke politely, thoughtfully, as if this was a seminar rather than an interrogation. That was the first unsettling detail. He showed no sense of crisis. For a man surrounded by 26 corpses disguised as dolls, he carried himself with the calm of someone explaining his latest research paper. His central argument never wavered. He had not harmed anyone. He repeated it with the confidence of a man who believed it absolutely. In his view, the crimes pinned on him were a misunderstanding born of society's obsession with appearances. He had not murdered those children, he reminded everyone again and again. He had rescued them. His language was soaked in compassion. Or what he thought was compassion. He claimed he had saved them from the damp earth, from the humiliation of worms and decay, from the cruelty of abandonment. Psychiatrists recognized the hallmark of delusion immediately. What he described was not madness in the frothing, violent sense, but a carefully built system of beliefs, consistent, logical to him, and utterly impermeable to contradiction. This was not the chaos of insanity. It was the order of a mind that had rearranged morality to suit its own trauma. At the heart of it all was that childhood memory. The funeral. The kiss on the dead girl's face. Most children process grief, however painfully, and move on. For Moskvin, it was a formative event. The spark that fused with loneliness and intellect to form a lifelong fixation. He told evaluators that from that day on, he felt bound to the dead, as if the veil between him and them had been pulled back permanently. In his world, death was not final. It was a state from which he could offer protection. His scholarly pursuits had fed the delusion instead of curing it. Thousands of articles on burial rituals, countless nights in graveyards, sleeping on tombs in imitation of druids and shamans. Each step felt to him like research, but in reality it was a self-reinforcing ritual. Every long night spent lying on a grave made him more certain that he could hear the spirits. Every map of cemeteries he compiled became, in practice, a catalogue of potential rescues. The academic language gave cover to what was, at its core, an obsession growing into compulsion. What psychiatrists found most striking was his lack of empathy for the living. He spoke eloquently about the loneliness of dead children, the cruelty of burying them, the duty he felt to care for them. But when asked about the parents who had discovered their daughters' graves empty, he appeared genuinely puzzled. He could not grasp their outrage. To him, they were the ones who had abandoned the children to the earth. He was the one who had lifted them out of it. Their grief was, in his mind, misplaced. And so his logic, grotesque as it was, held together neatly. He wanted daughters, he had none, so he adopted them from the ground. He wanted to protect innocence, so he targeted children. He wanted to be a guardian, not a predator. In his world, everything aligned. In ours, it was desecration. Doctors classified him under terms that struggled to capture the scope of what he had done. Schizophrenic spectrum disorder, delusional disorder, protective necromania, one specialist called it, trying to capture the bizarre mixture of tenderness and horror. He was not motivated by violence, but by a compulsion to reframe death as something he could nurture. That distinction mattered in court. He was not seen as a criminal with intent, but as a patient with an incurable distortion of reality. Legally, it meant he would not face prison. He would face indefinite psychiatric treatment instead. For the families of the girls, this was unbearable. To them, he was not a misunderstood scholar with delusions. He was the man who had stolen their daughters from their graves, forced them into grotesque costumes, and kept them as trophies. His philosophy of rescue was irrelevant to their pain. They wanted justice. What they received was the clinical language of psychiatry, declaring him too ill for punishment. The gap between how Anatoly saw himself as a savior and how the world saw him as a ghoul could never be closed. That was the true horror of his psychology. It was not only that he did what he did, it was that he never once admitted he was wrong. The courtroom in Nizhny Novgorod was packed, though few expected drama. By the time Anatoly Moskvin was brought before a judge in 2012, the facts were not in dispute. He had admitted everything. 26 exhumed children, turned into dolls, lived among for nearly a decade. The evidence was overwhelming. Photographs, forensic reports, his own detailed notes. What remained was the question of what to do with him. Moskvin entered the court calm, almost academic in posture, as if he had been invited to deliver a lecture rather than stand as a defendant. He did not avoid the cameras. He did not flinch under the gaze of grieving parents. Instead, he spoke softly, repeating the same defense that had carried him through psychiatric evaluations. He had harmed no one. He had saved those girls. He could not understand why people were so angry with him. The families, seated in rows behind the prosecution, felt their grief harden into fury. Some shouted at him, others wept openly, but Moskvin's expression barely shifted. When one mother cried that he had stolen her child's body, he answered with calm bewilderment, saying he had given her daughter a better life. The detachment was unbearable. For them, It was violation upon violation. First the grave robbed, then the daughter transformed into something grotesque, and now their pain dismissed as misunderstanding. The trial itself was brief, more a formality than a battle. Prosecutors laid out the evidence, the police testified to what they had found, and psychiatrists explained their diagnosis. They concluded that Moskvin suffered from a chronic mental disorder, one that stripped him of the ability to understand the criminality of his actions. He was declared unfit to stand trial in the conventional sense. The ruling was clear: he was not guilty by reason of insanity. Instead of prison, he would be confined indefinitely to a psychiatric clinic. For the Russian legal system, this was the only option. For the families, it felt like no justice at all. They had wanted a sentence, a measure of accountability, something that marked their daughter's desecration as a crime against them. What they got instead was the cold language of psychiatry, which transformed their grief into a medical case study. The press seized on the contrast. On one side, tearful parents begging for punishment. On the other, a man in glasses explaining calmly that he loved the children he had stolen. Headlines called him the puppet maker and the Lord of the Dolls, reducing unbearable pain into sensational nicknames. The case became international news, not only because of its grotesque details, but because of its conclusion. One of the most disturbing criminals in modern Russia would never see prison bars. For years after, the controversy lingered. Families petitioned for him to be declared sane enough to face trial. Prosecutors had to defend their decision again and again. Psychiatric reports insisted he remained dangerous, not because he would kill, but because his delusion was unbroken. He still believed he had done good, and as long as that belief held, he could never safely rejoin society. The trial had ended with no sense of closure. The dolls were gone, buried again, but the damage could not be undone. Parents had to live with the knowledge that their daughters' resting places had been violated. Their grief reopened. And Moskvin himself left the courtroom not as a criminal, but as a patient, a man whose fate now lay in the hands of psychiatrists, not judges. For the world, that was the final bitter twist. The man who had shocked a city, horrified a nation, and fascinated international media was not sentenced, but committed. And yet, even as the courtroom emptied, a final question remained. What would become of him inside the clinic? After the trial, the prison van never came for Anatoly Moskvin. Instead, he was transferred to a secure psychiatric clinic on the outskirts of Nizhny Novgorod. No handcuffs, no cell block, no sentence to count down. His confinement was open-ended, tethered not to years but to medical reports. He would remain there as long as doctors judged him unfit for release, which, in practice, meant possibly forever. The clinic became his world, just as the apartment full of dolls once had. He was treated with medication, supervised constantly, and subjected to regular evaluations. Forensic psychiatrists reported that he was compliant, polite, even cooperative. He followed routines, took part in therapeutic activities, and continued to insist, with the calm certainty of a professor, that he had never done anything wrong. That insistence was precisely the problem. His delusion remained intact. Every year, the question of his status resurfaced. Russian courts required periodic reviews to determine whether he was still a danger to society. Each time, the outcome was the same. His doctors concluded that he could not safely be released. He showed no remorse, no shift in perspective. He continued to refer to the dolls as his children. He maintained that he had saved them. That stubborn logic, the unshakable conviction of his innocence, was the clearest sign that he remained dangerous, even without violence. Meanwhile, the families of the girls continued to fight. They petitioned to have him kept inside indefinitely, horrified by any hint that he might one day walk free. For them, the very idea was intolerable. To release him, they argued, would be to invite him back to the cemeteries. The trauma they carried of having to bury their daughters twice, of knowing their graves had been emptied, was still raw. The thought of passing him on the street again was unbearable. In interviews over the years, Moskvin occasionally resurfaced in the media. His words never changed much. He was misunderstood. He had never harmed anyone. He had acted out of love, not malice. In some accounts, he even suggested that he could help families by preserving their children for them, as if his grotesque obsession were a service rather than a crime. These statements only reinforced the doctor's conclusions. The delusion was alive and well. As he aged, the strangeness of his fate deepened. He was not in prison, where criminals at least served time measured in years. He was in limbo. A man neither punished nor freed, living out his days in institutional corridors, his identity reduced to a clinical case file. Russia debated his status every time a new psychiatric report surfaced. Some commentators framed him as a symptom of a failed mental health system. Others as a monster who had been spared justice. The truth, perhaps, was that he was both. A sick man whose sickness had left a trail of horror behind him. Today, Anatoly Moskvin is an old man. He has no dolls, no workshop, no graveyards to wander. The clinic walls confine him. The routines dictate his days. Yet the obsession, by all accounts, has not left him. He remains convinced he did the right thing. Convinced that he gave comfort to children abandoned in the earth. For the families, that knowledge is no comfort at all. It means that the man who turned grief into theatre has not changed. Only the stage has. And so his story ends not with punishment, not with redemption, but with confinement. A life spent among the dead, now spent under lock and key, with no clear ending in sight. The puppet maker of Nizhny Novgorod lives on in whispers, case studies and nightmares. But the dolls themselves are gone, reburied, hopefully at rest at last. He's left with his memories, his delusions, and the silence of a world that has never forgiven him. And that's where we leave Anatoly Moskvin, a man who called himself a protector, who believed he was saving children from the loneliness of the earth, and who ended up confined to a psychiatric ward, still convinced he was right. His story is less about monsters in the dark and more about how obsession, unchecked and unchallenged, can twist into something the rest of us can barely comprehend. If you made it this far, you're part of the sleepless rabble that can drift off to the strangest corners of true crime without flinching. You know the deal. Hit like, subscribe if you want more nights like this, and if you'd like to keep the project going, you can always support over at ko-fi.com/Napmax. And don't forget, I asked earlier about the creepiest toy or object you had as a kid. Drop your answer in the comments, and let's see whose childhood bedroom wins the prize for most haunted. This was Napmax Sleep Stories. Not dolls, but children. Thanks for listening, and good night.